to AfriCanDo. Welcome to you all to the first AfriCanDo live debate. My name is Estelle Youssouffa. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the very first AfriCanDo live debates, as I said. We're here in Marrakesh, very excited to be here for the Atlantic Dialogues that's organized by the OCP Policy Center, a Moroccan think tank that brings a southern perspective to economic and international relation issues. The OCP Policy Center also organized, in margin of the Atlantic Dialogues, the Emerging Leaders Program, which brings together the best and the brightest of the Atlantic Basin region. It's young leaders who have shown incredible leadership and initiative in their own field. Together, we'll be discussing with four of them. We're very happy to have them with us. We'll be discussing aid in Africa. That is the topic of our discussion. So we have Sam Mandela Utoni, who is with us, a diplomat working on regional integration at the office of the chairperson at the African Union Commission. Welcome. Next to him, Najet Abdallah, who is an analyst at Dolberg Advisors in Addis Ababa. Najet specializes in the areas of humanitarian assistance, food security, and migration. Melansho Chakrabarti is currently working at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. She's an associate fellow. Welcome to you. And next to her is Anas Oulmidi, a surgeon from the Moroccan University Hospital Center and a humanitarian. Welcome to you, doctor. Welcome to you all. Really, it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you all with us. I want also to welcome our viewers. You can jump in the discussion on social media using the hashtag AfriCanDo and the hashtag Emerging Leaders. Now, before we start, I want to set the record straight on aid in Africa with a few facts. So life-saving humanitarian aid is only a small fraction of total aid, because aid is money and much more. It's also goods, technical assistance, educational programming, and other services. Recipients are indeed foreign governments, including foreign militaries and security forces, local businesses and charity groups, NGOs, and international relations. Now, the world's largest aid donors by volume are the US, the UK, Germany, France, and Japan. Now, China is now the largest non-traditional contributor of aid to sub-Saharan Africa countries, reaching $3 billion in 2015. And China's aid is focused on debt relief and supports projects in agriculture, infrastructure, industry, public facilities, education, medical and health care. That's for Chinese aid. And if you want to talk about the countries that China targets with its aid, it's Nigeria, Ghana, Sudan, which are the largest recipients. And the majority of this aid goes to energy infrastructure such as pipelines, oil pipelines to be precise. Now, to frame this discussion, I am lucky enough to have by my side the Moroccan pundit and sustainable development advocate Mamoun Ghallab. He's with us to shed a few lights and a few thoughts to kickstart our debate.
Thank you, Estelle. To start, I'd say that yes, aid has had very positive impact in helping saving millions of lives and building vital infrastructure in Africa. But still, evidence shows that the actual models have to be reconsidered. We have to reconsider them because international aid is too often linked to geopolitical interest and commercial interests, because also of poor governance in recipient countries, and this makes that a little part of the aid goes really to the people that need it. Also, aid is part of a very large system where countries are bound with unfair free trade agreements. They're bound also and drawn under heavy debt. And when we see that after decades of aid in Africa and about $1 trillion given and distributed across Africa, still many African countries are poorer than in the 1960s. Well, my thought is that aid only calls for more aid until it becomes kind of a vital input. Also, knowing that we have to reconsider the new models and explore new models. Models that create wealth and social welfare, models that foster economic and political independence of the recipients, models that create jobs, models also that empower the people so that they can unleash their potential and create value by themselves, for themselves. Also, aid, for me, has to be considered as a seed fund to impulse long-term value creation mechanisms, nothing like charity. I want to give few examples, just examples that help me rethink aid models. First one, in Kenya, a US NGO called Give Directly chose a village and they're giving $20 a month to every and each adult in the village for 12 years. The idea is to create a universal revenue, and the bet is that this will give them more perspective and unleash their potential to create value for themselves, way above those little $20 that are distributed. South co-development models also are very interesting. China, India, Morocco, South Africa, different scales are investing a lot of money in Africa with this promise of long-term partnerships and job creation, knowledge transfer. Well, that's great, but still many Africans are having an eye and waiting to see if those countries are really trustworthy. Multilateral African solidarity, like it is done in the African Risk Capacity, that is the first African-owned disaster response system where 32 countries participate with $3 million each a year, and this has helped countries from the Sahel with $26 million in 2015, and they were facing a massive drought, and this has allowed them to help 1.3 million people. It's a small amount of money compared with the whole aid, but it's still a very good starting point. Self-reliance mechanisms are essential for me. Rwanda is giving a very good example. The Umuganda is an initiative where once a month, every adult in the country gives 1 day of community work, building roads, schools, houses for the poor, cleaning cities, whatever is needed for the development. They do it, and it's giving good results. So for me, now, as Trump is trying to cut down the international aid, well, it can be an historical opportunity for us to reconsider aid, and all we need, I think, is some more political will to change.
Thank you, Mamoun. That's many ideas to chew on. And indeed, aid raises multiple questions. Is charity really charitable? Is it a neo-colonialism in disguise? What are the strings attached to aid? Is aid addictive for the recipient countries? Does it really help the country develop? What about performance, accountability? I want our guest views on that and on the many more questions that we have raised. I will start with Sam Utoni. 63% of the budget of the African Union, where you're working, is paid by foreign donors, the EU being the biggest contributor. Contribution reform is actually underway, but African countries are known, some of them, are known to be reluctant to pay. Would you say that Africa is addicted to aid?
Addicted wouldn't be the word I would use, but you are correct in saying that for the past decade or so, a large portion of our budget has not come from African countries. So there is something that is happening in the African Union which is called the African Union reform, or the Kagame reform. And what you're trying to do is really, apart from reforming the financing, we're really trying to reform the way the entire institution works. And part of that, one of the priorities in the reform is really financing of the union, because we have come to a point where we have realized that it is not sufficient or even effective for us to depend on another union to finance our own union. And part of that is really getting our member states to pay their dues. And as you said,
it's proven difficult somehow.
Yes, it's proven difficult. It's not particularly an easy thing to do, because when you look at member states, they have their own challenges. They have their own challenges that they're trying to address. But then at the same time, I think it's more so about recognizing the importance of the African Union as a continental body. And of course, there are frameworks that have been put in place in order to get some of these member states to pay up. But then within our jurisdiction and within our mandate, we cannot compel member states to pay. Of course, them being a member, they're required to pay. But there's really limitations to what we can do to members who do not pay.
Would you say it's a difficult transformation?
Of course, I think any transformation is difficult, and particularly a transformation of an institution that has been in existence for 30, 40 years, and now trying to really relook at our working methods, our financing methods, is not an easy thing to do. But then at the same time, it's definitely not an impossible thing, and I think it's quite an ambitious plan that we have, but once we go through with it, I think we'll have a new revamped African Union that is 100% sustainable, that works in line with the continental priorities and continental problems that we are experiencing.
You know, Sam, you're our very first guest on the AfriCanDo debate. We can hold you accountable and have you come back. We don't know when, but we could. So we'll see if the African Union manages to get its own independence, because that's really what this is about. But aid is also about saving lives, and I'm turning to you, Najet Abdallah. You specialize, as I said, in humanitarian assistance and food security at Dolberg Advisors. You're based in Ethiopia, and I mention this because the region is suffering from a very severe food crisis this year in the Horn of Africa. How critical is aid to the survival of people in the region?
The short answer to that would be very. In the Horn of Africa, we've been suffering from food crisis for the past 25 years. It's been extremely difficult since 2015, as you've said, with the El Nino effect. In the Horn of Africa, over 16 million people have been affected. In Ethiopia, it's close to 8.5 million now. Short-term consequences it is claiming millions of lives. But you see the long-term consequences in terms of with the food crisis, there's watery diarrhea being reported. There's high rates of malnutrition are going up. And with high rates of malnutrition, what you're getting is these children that are growing up, it's going to affect productivity in the long term. It's going to affect Ethiopia's economic development in the long term. So with all these long-term consequences, aid, especially food aid, is really critical to curb the consequences, to save lives, but also to ensure that we will be able to manage this food crisis moving forward.
But it's been known that food aid especially is impacting negatively the development of the local agribusiness. In that regard, there's a lot of discussions around this short-term answer on, feeding the people now. And then if you're disrupting the local system, do you think that's a question that is being asked in the region? Do you think that the emergency, the crisis situation somehow impedes governments to really address the core issue, or some actually argue it's about climate change, period, so there isn't much that can be done?
Somewhat. I think the question that is really being asked is, are we getting the necessary aid or the amount of aid that we need? And the question, and a lot of the articles that are being posted now, and a lot of the research shows, is that we're not tapping into the resources we need. In fact, Ethiopia is pretty much scared that we're going to run out of food aid to meet the needs. And the reason being...
Would you say you need more food aid?
Yes. Estimates suggest that by July of next year, we're going to be running out of the amount of food aid that we need. And the simple answer to that is because of donor fatigue. There's humanitarian emergencies popping up in different parts of the world, and attention is, being
short span.
Exactly.
Say that. Short span at the White House, actually, where we see that President Trump is actually calling for a reduction of 28% of American aid, the US being the largest donor. How do you think the region can adapt to this changing environment in terms of the donor perspective?
I think this would link back to what our colleague just said, where you can see this as an opportunity, I would say. And what this would mean is that we would actually be looking for other models of getting resources, whether it's South-South cooperation, whether it's looking into homegrown solutions, whether it's promoting our own agribusiness. This is an opportunity for us to actually explore what else can be done.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Melansha. As I mentioned, China is a newcomer in aid for Africa. India and Brazil are also developing aid. Mamoun mentioned Morocco as well, South Africa. Do you think that they are game changers, or do you think that they're operating like Western aid?
Absolutely game changers. And their model of development cooperation, and it's not traditional aid, is very different from how the West delivered aid to Africa. So to just outline the major difference between how China and India cooperate with Africa as opposed to the West, the first and the most important difference is that it is not like a donor aid recipient relationship. So at the outset, it's more commercial, and it's more of a partnership. So it's not coming from the West and going to Africa. So,
but is it just semantics?
Not really. To just elaborate on the point that I'm trying to make, you spoke about India, and both India and China's cooperation is mostly project financing. So in case of India, we have lines of credit, which is the bulk of our development, comprises the bulk of our development cooperation with Africa. And in this case, each African country identifies its own development needs and identifies the project that it needs and develops that project, comes to the Indian embassy with that project, then it gets approved by the Indian officials. So the whole idea is...
Are you talking about that?
This is concessional credit.
So it's that.
It's concessional credit is also a form of aid. So if it's concessional, I mean, when we talk about aid, it's important to understand that it's bulk of it, in case of India, is lines of credit. Some are grants. So in both cases, the respect for the point that I was trying to make was that the African country identifies its needs
rather than having
rather than
parachuted to the country.
So rather than India or China coming and telling them, hey, this is what you need and we're going to give you this, it's more like the African country trying to identify its own needs and coming up with a project, and that gets delivered. So in certain instances, particularly in case of China, it's really huge. The scale is huge, and China's helped develop a lot of infrastructure in Africa.
And it's going to be doing more. With the AIB.
Yes, absolutely. So India's development cooperation cannot really match China in terms of scale, but where India scores is in technical assistance and also the projects that it finances. For instance, Ethiopia is a good example where the sugar manufacturing in Ethiopia has developed with India's help. So we call it cooperation and we call it development cooperation, so it's not aid in the traditional sense. And in some sense now I think the Western model is also changing, taking inspiration from China and India. There are problems. I won't paint a perfectly rosy picture. There are problems, and development sector is all about continuously evaluating where you've gone wrong. And
if you could just point one, what would it be?
For instance, in case of China, there have been issues with regard to job creation, because many of the African, because they're bringing a lot of Chinese workers. So that hasn't happened in case of India.
But surely there's questions with Indian...
With India, I think the major problem that we are facing is with regard to delivering and implementing the projects on time and finishing things on time. So that is an area where India is currently working a lot on. With regard to China, I think there are also, apart from local employment generation, there are also in some cases issues of how the local environment is suffering, in many cases water bodies or the land, etc. So these are issues that need to be considered much more effectively, and we need to learn how to deal with them.
Merci, Madame Chou. We'll come back to you. I want to turn now to Anas Oulmidi, doctor, should I say? As we see that Western aid is being questioned. We have a reform going on in Africa. You're a Moroccan surgeon, and you're helping with medical aid back home,
Yes.
but also in the region. Do you think that homegrown solutions are the way to go? Are they the future?
Okay, it's important. We are discussing here the international aid, and
But I think that as a practitioner, it's quite important to hear your view.
I get you. But our continent really needs this help? We know that 23% of the Africans are still in malnutrition. We know that maybe 2/3 of them still live with less than $1 a day. So it seems that we need that aid. But on the other hand, you know that 1 out of 4 countries in Africa is now poorer than the early 60s. Even they keep receiving this international aid. So we are allowed to ask the question for ourselves. And another number, and this will be the last one, there are 135 billion of international aid each year, which is spread each year. But 85% of it goes directly to the government of the countries. And 14% of it goes directly to foreign organizations who want to help in Africa. And only 1%, or to be exact, 0.8% goes to local organizations which want to help themselves.
To be clear,
yes.
You're pointing out the fact that international aid goes to mainly international charities, foreign charities, rather than homegrown NGOs.
Exactly, and we need to explore a new way of thinking and a new way of helping ourselves. You know, in the health sector, who defines health like a complete well-being on physical, mental, and social. Sorry for my English; it's not my first language. But we need to understand that the locals have the solution, and that if we want to help them, you have to listen to them and to use the solution they propose. And unfortunately, in the health, I don't want to say industry, but you know, in the health, humanitarian health work, we here in Morocco, we also often receive medical caravans, you know, that come to small villages in the mountains and do the same thing. They come, they find people who are sick from small disease like parasitism maybe, and they treat it. They come back, another group come back 2 months after, they have the same disease because the water is not good, the sanitation is not good. It will be...
You're talking about short fixes
exactly,
for long-term
exactly.
issues.
When you are willing to help from abroad, you need short-term goals because you need
wins,
to to have more funds maybe. But the long terms can only be managed by the people of the country and of the place.
You will hold that thought. We will come back to it because you mentioned figures, and we have figures as well.
Okay.
We worked on it. We are going to take a look at a few facts with this video.
Poverty reduction benefits all society and helps create a more stable world. Africa certainly made some progress in the last few decades. However, the absolute numbers still show a lot of human hardship. Aid has managed to mitigate disasters, but the malnourishment rate is still 23%, and 2 in 5 sub-Saharans subsist on less than $1.25 a day. And the problem goes beyond worsening inequality. 1 in 4 African countries are poorer now than in the 60s. That is the case even though countries like Liberia get up to 73% of their GDP from outer aid, but they still rank 177 out of 188 in terms of human development. Nowadays, evidence exists to show that organic economic growth reduces poverty more reliably than donations. In this context, should aid to Africa still be a priority? What practices are most promising for the future of our continent? Learn the facts and join the debate using hashtag AfriCanDo.
So we've seen that aid is very controversial, and it can be discussed, let's say that. I wanted to bring you a piece of news that, broke the internet recently. That's President Macron, French President Macron, visiting Western Africa, and his discussion with Ghana's president, Akufo-Addo, who went viral when he actually explained a very African and proud point of view. I will quote the president for those of you who haven't heard his statement. He was next to President Macron, who fidgeted a bit, slightly uncomfortable, or not expecting that strong statement. So the Ghanaian president said, "We can no longer continue to make policy for ourselves in our country, in our region, in our continent, on the basis of whatever support the Western world or France or the European Union can give us. It will not work, it has not worked, and it will not work. We have to get away from this mindset of dependency." I'm turning to you. Do you think that if you look at the reaction, the overwhelming support that was expressed online, do you think that the Ghanaian president struck a chord which is about pride, in a way?
Not particularly. I think the message actually resonated a lot, particularly with a lot of Africans, because I think we're coming to the realization that, as His Excellency said, this aid has not particularly worked. At least it has not produced the effective results that we wanted it to produce. So I think now a lot of Africans are beginning to realize that we need other alternatives. And of course, the reality is that we need financing for our development. But as the president said, aid might not or is not the best way to go about that. I think one thing that we can look at, primarily, it's really about the equitable distribution of resources, because you look at most of these countries on the African continent who have rife poverty and are struggling economically. You look at their elites, you look at the presidents, you look at the prime ministers, and you look at the lifestyle that they are living, and you look at the lifestyle that the citizens are living, are two completely different lifestyles. So you see where the resources of the country are going, you see where somewhat the priorities are. But I think once you can get that out of the way and really have good governance and accountable governance, especially when it comes to distribution of resources and the benefits thereof, I think we won't particularly need aid anymore.
Mamoun, governance?
Yeah, governance, it's a very, very important point, and I would like to raise an example that is linked to what we've seen in the video and to this discourse. In the video, we heard that 73% of Liberia's GDP comes out of aid. We have another country that is highly dependent to aid because of its history and so on. It's Rwanda. But Rwanda is showing today capacity to slightly get rid of this aid dependency. The aid rate, let's say, is going down, and they have quite a good GDP ratio. In the last decade, they had plus 5.2% GDP on average each year. And even if they don't have any natural resource, they don't have access to ocean, they're quite lost in the middle of the continent. They are becoming a tech hub, and it might be a good example to follow. I don't know if they're going to do it, but they might be the first one to break free from aid, I think.
Do you think that governance is one of the issues?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, governance is one of the major issues why we are all dissatisfied with aid today. So being able to implement what we would want to desire in an effective manner, in a completely fair and transparent manner, has been one of the biggest challenges in the development sector. And it's important that, it's good that we now recognize it as a real problem, but in terms of I mean, I agree with you on when you speak about Rwanda succeeding more than any other country, but I think we need to think a little bit more on how to bring about that success. There are other countries like Angola, for instance, is facing a severe crisis when it comes to governance. So, but how do we bring that about? You know, it's, as a development economist, I'm more concerned with, you know,
something that relies more on a system than a man.
Yes.
Najat, do you think that governance is also an issue for donors? Do you think that part of the fatigue that you mentioned has been brought about by Africans themselves and the issue of poor governance that they showed?
Yes.
Is it a bad track record?
I'll definitely say it is an issue. Attached to governance issue is weak institutions. It's weak policies as well. So I feel like it's a lot of interrelated factors that do contribute to donor fatigue. And once we talk about aid as well, there's a lot of, specifically with humanitarian aid, I'll say, is what causes donor fatigue is all these processes in place in terms of when you can appeal for humanitarian aid, how you report back, the mechanisms and systems and structure in terms of what you use the money for. All of these compounded do contribute to donor fatigue.
As in, there's too much or there's not enough?
As in the system is
Because
just...
that's, you know, speaking from a recipient point of view, there's
Yeah.
a lot of anger. You know, some of the donors see all the mechanisms that you described as a way of controlling the recipient.
Yeah.
The fatigue is what, too much or too little?
I think from the donor side is that they feel like, you know, they have been giving too much, whereas on the recipient side, we feel like it's obviously not enough.
Doctor,
Yes.
what would be your thought?
Actually, about the governance issue, I don't think it's one of the issues. I think it's the only issue. You know that African countries or African continent is depository of maybe more than 30% of the most important minerals in the world. We have, as the Ghanaian president say, we have the world fast arable and fertile land. We have the youngest population. So how could you explain the situation of African country if it's not by lack of governance?
I would also want to mention, in all fairness, that African philanthropy is also developing. It's a new phenomena that is really interesting. And if we're talking about African wealth, there's also this new trend of having some of them trying to give away and actually contribute to more equally shared wealth, if that is possible. I think it's now time for us to take the questions from our viewers. I'm very thankful you've been quite active online. So the first one would be, why does aid seem to come mostly from commercial partners? That would be to you.
From
They are sharp, our viewers are sharp.
Yes, really sharp.
So why does aid seem to come mostly from commercial partners?
I think it's a tricky question also because, you know, aid in its traditional sense is not supposed to be commercial. And when we talk about partnership, then that is where the commercial relationship comes in. But I'm not sure if I'm so much against countries having a commercial interest and therefore coming into another country. Now, as a practical person, you know, I like to live in the real world, and in the real world, you know, is dominated by economic interests and commercial interests also. But commercial interest in any one country, which one country has with another country, need not necessarily be against the interests. So a true partnership could lead to development in both the countries, the one which is financing development in the other country as well as the recipient country. So I'm not totally against commercial relationship between two countries either.
So there you have it. Another question would be, I always cringe when I see celebrities getting involved in aid. Do they really have a positive impact for populations? That would be to you, Dr. and then Najat, I think.
Okay, actually I don't share the same opinion. When you are on the field, it doesn't matter if, even for the commercial stuff that we discussed earlier, it doesn't really matter if another person take credit for this work, because the people really needs this. So if another country or a celebrity is using this aid to maybe gain something else elsewhere, it's not good, but it's I don't think that should stop us from getting this aid.
You say let's stay focused on the impact and the
exactly.
result, whatever.
Exactly, and will be maybe a second step. But right now, there are people who suffer and who need help now, and we can discuss what we can do and how to do it better after.
Najat.
Okay. So I think one of the positive aspects of having celebrities tied in with aid issues is the fact that they do bring awareness to whatever the topic is. You know, whether it's Bono, you know, that brought light to the food crisis. They have been able to, you know, share the message to a wider audience, and they have been able to bring more awareness to the issues and get more people to talk about it. So as a starting point, I do see some value in it. But I do feel like with celebrities getting more and more involved in aid, it does detract from the situation at hand and from actually getting meaningful work out of the way.
So we need to be a bit more strategic in terms of media coverage and celebrity coverage.
Exactly.
Not to distract ourselves from the real issues.
Yes.
A third question would be, as sometimes here $1 billion a year could exterminate world hunger. That's a bit of a statement. Is that true? I wonder as well. Is it even possible to achieve this goal? Tell me, what would be your thoughts? Yeah, I think that's for you.
Oh gosh. Moving away from the figures, I think it's quite ambitious. The figures themselves are quite ambitious. But I think there is definitely potential that exists on the African continent and globally, really, to end global hunger, if we wanted to, or even to reduce it by a significant amount. I think when we look at the enabling environments, most of them we have, when we look at the African continent, the capacity in terms of human capacity, the land, which is really the main thing, and then now the financial resources to, I guess, get started, whether it's on agricultural projects or whatsoever. So when you look at the enabling environments, most of them we do have, but then most of the times we have the financial resources which are not available. So I think with $1 billion, if there is available, I think we can do quite a lot. Not 100% sure if we can eradicate all the poverty, but I think we can do quite a lot with it.
We can work on it.
Yes.
I think that we have to end it there.
Yeah.
We're already out of time, but Mamoun has a few thoughts to wrap things up.
Yeah. There are many interesting ideas that have been said during this debate. What I want to keep in mind is first, as you said, Africa is not addicted to aid, but at the same time we need aid for emergency situations. And this is slightly a problem because of the donors' fatigue. So in this situation, I think it's really the moment to work on long-term partnerships, long-term mechanisms, reinforce the basis of our value creation capacity. So empower people, build capacities. For example, on food, working on climate change adaptation is something is absolutely essential and urgent, while at the same time receiving aid to feed the hungry people. The South Corporation have to reinforce this specific capacity of building a long-term empowerment and not only be driven by self-interest. True partnerships, where the word was said, I think it's something absolutely crucial. And we still have one big issue that is not solved, and I think it's really very important, and at the core of the problem, it's governance. I'm sad to say I don't have the magic solution for governance, but clearly this is our role of each one of us to ask for accountability and work hard on this. Governance, long-term capacity building. I think that's really what Africa needs. And as a young African, I have good hopes that we can do it.
Yes, that's the theme of the discussion. Thank you so much, Mamoun, Sem, Nejat, Mélenchon, Anas. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. I wish you a very brilliant and entertaining discussions with the Emerging Leaders Program at the Atlantic Dialogues. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to keep the conversation going with the hashtag AfriCanDo, the hashtag Emerging Leaders on social media. and also using at ATL_dialogues, at OCP Policy Center, or at OCP Groups. I mean, you name it. Just keep the conversation going. Join us again, though, tomorrow with more Atlantic Dialogues Emerging Leaders, maybe some new ones, for another AfriCanDo debate. Tomorrow we'll be discussing education in Africa. We'll be very excited and waiting for you. From all the AfriCanDo team here, goodbye.